Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Turkey's military operation in Afrin enters a new phase following reports of a pro-Syrian government militia entering the region on Tuesday.
Turkey's ongoing military operation in Afrin reaches its 35th day. Since the launch of the operation on January 20th, the Turkish military and the Free Syrian Army have taken under control a region of 415 square kilometers, including 71 villages and 20 strategic mountains. In response to the operation, informal pro-Assad forces, widely known as the Popular Forces, were deployed into Afrin after a deal reached between the Syrian government and YPG. Reuters reported that the pro-Syrian government fighters started entering the contested region of Afrin on Tuesday. The Syrian government had denounced the Turkish offensive as a blatant attack on its sovereignty earlier in the month. Yet, hours before the deployment, Turkey had warned that pro-Assad forces would face serious consequences for entering Syria's Afrin region to help Kurdish fighters repel a Turkish offensive. These kinds of terror organizations take wrong steps in the decisions they take. It is not possible for us to allow this. They will pay a heavy price, President Erdogan said in a news conference. Furthermore, President Erdogan's spokesman said shell fire had forced an earlier convoy to retreat. Any step by the regime or other elements in this direction will surely have serious consequences, Ibrahim Kalın told the reporters. Kalın added that Turkey was not in direct talks with the Syrian government, but its messages to Damascus were being indirectly conducted. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made statements on the issue as well. In response to questions on Afrin, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov urged all Syrian combatants to talk to the Syrian government within Syria's territorial integrity. Meanwhile, in a statement, the Turkish General Staff said that a YPG convoy of 30 to 40 vehicles was intercepted by the Turkish Air Force about 15 kilometers southeast of Afrin.
Our guest via Skype tonight is Ömer Taşpınar, who's joining us from Washington, D.C., and who is a Turkey expert at the Brookings Institution. Good evening, Mr. Taşpınar. Welcome once again to This Week in Turkey.
Thank you. Good evening.
So the Western media, as well as the Syrian Arab News Agency, reported this week that a convoy of pro-Syrian government forces have entered Afrin to help the Kurdish YPG militia, which is currently being fought by the Turkish army. It looks like this may be the start of a whole new phase in Turkey's Operation Olive Branch. What do you think?
Well, it is indeed a new phase because this pro-regime militia is probably supported by elements that are close to the Iranian government. And Iran, as you know, has been very active in propping up, supporting the regime in Damascus via its Lebanese proxy force, Hezbollah, as well as the Revolutionary Guards themselves. And there's a new phase in Syria, not just because there's this interesting development in terms of regime elements helping the Kurds against Turkey, which shows that there's a potential for Iranian-Turkish confrontation. But also, Israel is taking military action with new audacity within the country, and there has been also Israeli attacks to Syrian military bases, where Iranian as well as Russian forces have been targeted, and also the United States has taken military action against a group in the eastern part of the Euphrates near Deir al-Zor a couple of weeks ago that appears to be pro-Russian mercenaries. In fact, Russian mercenaries, not Russian forces themselves, but private military companies friendly with the president of Russia, Putin, have been very active in the country, and they attacked Syrian Democratic Forces bases near Deir al-Zor, and the Russians have retaliated. The United States has retaliated with ferocity, as the Washington Post reports today about what happened 2 weeks ago, and close to 100 Russian mercenaries have been killed. So these are important developments because it shows that despite the fact that there seems to be a sense that Syria continues as a civil war, there is definitely a new bloody phase where the proxy confrontations are gaining increasingly a more open phase of military warfare between Israel and Iran, between Turkey and potentially the regime, of course, Turkey and the Kurdish forces, but also Russia and the United States. So this second phase of the Syrian war, in that sense, is potentially much more dangerous than the earlier phase where regional forces were fighting on the ground, not directly but through proxies.
So, as just like you've mentioned in your response, it's being reported widely that these pro-Syrian government forces that have entered Afrin are most probably backed by Iran. But there seems to be quite a deep paradox here, as Turkey and Iran had pledged to redesign the future of Syria together with Russia as part of the Astana process. So how accurate would it be in this case to frame the current situation in Afrin as a confrontation between Turkey and Iran, perhaps?
It's not yet an open confrontation. It could turn into a tacit confrontation because it won't be Iranian forces themselves, the Iranian military, but again, forces close to the Iranian regime that will be fighting with Turkey. It clearly shows, however, that the so-called common vision that's supposed to exist between Iran, Turkey, and Russia about the future of Syria is absent. There is no common vision. There is no real agreement and consensus, simply because basically Turkey has its own agenda, its own national security interests. Iran has its own interests, which are strongly aligned with the survival of the regime and not allowing pro-US forces or Turkish forces gaining ground in Syria. And Russia also follows, definitely, its own agenda. In fact, it should not be surprising that Turkey, Iran, and Russia have different visions about the future of Syria. The more dangerous part is that beyond having different visions and different projects for the future of Syria, right now there seems to be really diverging interests, national security interests on the ground.
So another important development from this week was a statement from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's actually not said, but called for direct talks between Damascus and Ankara, which is something that Ankara strictly opposes. How likely do you think is this?
Well, I think the spokesperson for the president, Ibrahim Kalın, admitted that there has been some level of dialogue between Ankara and Damascus at the level of the intelligence community, at the level of probably the Turkish intelligence and the Syrian intelligence, which shows that we should not be surprised if indeed at one point there is a more direct diplomatic communication between Syria and Damascus. This is certainly something that Iranians and the Russians would welcome, because it would mean that Ankara considers the regime in Damascus as a legitimate one, at least a regime that needs to be taken into account as a legitimate counterpart. So it is clear that this is what Russia wants from Turkey, and this would be a big win in terms of Russia, because the regime in Damascus, in this dialogue with Turkey, would have certain demands, probably in line with Russian demands, such as Turkey stopping its support for the Free Syrian Army, or forces that are close to the more radical jihadist wings, such as HTS. So you have a situation where, again, I think Russia is manipulating the situation and is exploiting the weakness in Turkey's strategy, which was based on a quick victory in Afrin and putting pressure on the United States to stop its cooperation with the Syrian Kurdish forces further east of Afrin in Manbij. This is not happening. On the strategic front, I don't think Turkey is really achieving its strategic or military objectives as quickly, at least, as it envisioned before this military incursion.
And Mr. Taşpınar, finally, do you think that this rather dire situation faced by Turkey could have domestic repercussions? Obviously, I'm asking this with reference to the 2019 elections or a possible case of early elections, perhaps, although this possibility has been completely ruled out earlier today by Berat Albayrak, the energy minister. So my question to you is, basically, will this situation in Afrin, in your opinion, have domestic repercussions?
Well, it is obvious that there is a nationalist frenzy right now in Turkey, and there's really anger against the United States and strong support for the Turkish military. However, strong support for the Turkish military is conditional on achieving effective results. If there's a mounting number of Turkish soldiers returning home in body bags and killed by Kurdish forces or pro-Iranian militias, and if Turkey is engulfed in a quagmire in Syria, I don't think the Turkish public will continue to support this military operation with the level of enthusiasm that it has shown so far. So I think if President Erdogan had early elections in mind, he probably has it for July of this summer. The rumor has it that if elections are held on the anniversary of the failed coup, that may benefit, according to opinion polls, even more the president himself and his party. That means basically mid-July. And there are still several months to July, and as I said, Turkey is not even close to having achieved any semblance of victory. On the other hand, the economy is not doing so well either. I think at the end of the day, Turkish voters, like most voters in the world, do not vote based on foreign policy issues. They vote based on economic bread and butter issues regarding the economic dynamics, and consumer confidence is very important. And on that front, too, I think there's a sense of urgency for Erdogan because things are not going well. Despite very high levels of economic growth, inflation is back, unemployment is creeping up, and there's a lot of discontent among consumers that they don't see really a significant increase in living standards. And in that sense, Erdogan may use some distraction on the foreign policy front. But again, I repeat that if that foreign policy front is causing problems and not achieving clear results, things may not go as brightly as is wishing. And of course, the worst case scenario would be the PKK deciding to take action in Turkey. So far, the dog that did not bark in this whole story is the fact that the PKK forces within Turkey are laying low and have not really launched a wave of new terrorist attacks. And it's very possible that come election time, the PKK could actually do certain things that may weaken Erdogan. So it's going to be indeed, as he declared today, I think, the president, a hot summer. And it will be a hot summer for Turkish-American relations, and it will be a hot summer for Turkish domestic politics and Turkish foreign policy in general.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taşpınar, for your comments and for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Speaking to his party group at the parliament this week, President Erdogan announced that his government will take measures to impose heavy penalties against child abusers, adding that adultery should also be considered within the same scope.
Turkey should consider criminalizing adultery once again, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said this week, revisiting an issue that sparked outrage among secular Turks and warnings from the European Union when his party raised it more than a decade ago. With regards to his government's backtracking from legislation that would criminalize adultery in 2004, Erdogan said it was a mistake. Speaking to his party group at the parliament, Erdogan said his government will also take stringent measures and impose heavy penalties against child abusers, adding that adultery should be considered within the same scope as child abuse. On the same day, Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül said that the government was considering introducing chemical castration for child sex offenders by putting in place the relevant regulations in a couple of days. Deputy Prime Minister Bekir Bozdağ also announced that a commission of 6 ministers had been formed to deal with the child abuse issue, while the president's chief aide, İbrahim Kalın, said the ministry was already working on a bill to punish adulterers. Turkey introduced a measure to chemically castrate those convicted of sex crimes in 2016, but the country's highest administrative court, the Council of State, stopped its implementation last August, saying its definition and limit were vague. As to the adultery issue, AKP first prompted the idea in 2004, 2 years after it first came to power, as part of a broad overhaul of the Turkish Penal Code. But the proposal caused a backlash from the secular opposition, and EU officials said it could jeopardize Turkey's efforts to join the Union.
A proposal submitted to the Parliament this week is expected to enable the ruling Justice and Development Party to form a pre-election alliance with the Nationalist Movement Party.
The legislative proposal that allows political parties to form pre-election alliances was submitted to the Parliament this week by the Joint Commission members of the ruling Justice and Development Party and the Nationalist Movement Party. The 26-article proposal makes amendments in different laws on electorates, local elections and political parties. The articles of the proposal are not entirely about election alliances. There are amendments about local elections. Some of them are about previous experiences and election security, said Parliamentary Constitutional Commission head and AKP lawmaker Mustafa Şentop after the proposal was submitted. A joint commission of AKP and MHP members finalized work on the amendments, and the package took its final form following President Erdogan's meeting with MHP leader Devlet Bahçeli on Sunday. According to the current law, the only way for a political party to form an alliance with another party would be to enter the election under its political roof. The amendment package includes provisions that allow political parties to enter into elections as an alliance while keeping their political party emblem in the ballot box papers. The emblems of political parties that form an alliance will be next to each other in the ballot papers, and the name of the alliance will be written above their logos. The package does not amend the 10% threshold. However, for the parties that form an alliance, the threshold will apply to the sum of the votes of the alliance and not the individual parties within the alliance. That is, if an alliance passes the 10% threshold, all the parties within the alliance will be deemed to have passed it, regardless of their individual vote share. The number of lawmakers will also be determined according to the sum of the votes of the alliance. The MHP has been demanding to keep its political identity in the parliamentary elections. With the new regulation, the MHP will be able to continue to enjoy treasury grants, as its pre-election alliance with the AKP assures that it will not have a threshold problem. The AKP, on the other hand, needs 50% of the votes in presidential elections to make Erdogan's future presidency possible, and Devlet Bahçeli has already announced that his party will support Erdogan in the 2019 presidential elections. The package also includes provisions regarding election safety, according which the ballot boxes could be relocated over security reasons, and constituencies can also be unified or mixed. In the new regulation, citizens will be allowed to file a complaint about ballot box officers or voting procedures, which also allows private security officers, armed personnel, and police forces to be present in the ballot box rooms. With the new regulation, the unsealed ballot papers will be regarded valid. The Supreme Election Board's decision to regard the unsealed papers valid was harshly criticized by the opposition in the constitutional referendum on April 16th. Main opposition Republican People's Party spokesperson Bülent Tezcan criticized the AKP-MHP pre-election coalition, saying that there is a one-man coalition, and this coalition has only one aim, which is to implement a one-man regime. Tezcan also said the new proposal that paves the way for pre-election alliances aims to make Erdogan win the following presidential elections.
Our friend Sinan Akgünay did an interview this week on Russian-Turkish relations with respect to the developments in Syria with Oksana Antonenko from the London School of Economics.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned that Russian approach to olive branch operation has not been one of strong support, but rather acquiescence. And this acquiescence, in my view, remains to be conditional. And there are two conditions that are quite important here. The first one, clearly, Moscow doesn't want to see the Afrin operation to expand into a kind of all-out Kurdish-Turkish conflict along the very large area of northern Syria, because any such conflict can undermine the perception of the political stabilization in Syria, which Russia wants very strongly to project. Of course, President Putin has already declared, we know, in December, that the military phase of the operation is supposed to be over, and Russia is starting to pull out its forces. And it wanted to create an impression that the political settlement is making a real progress. And partly the reason for that is, of course, the Russian-owned public opinion. The latest opinion polls in Moscow indicate that 49% of the Russian population want to see the end of Russia's military intervention in Syria. Only less than 25% actually support continuing Russian presence in Syria, and that is quite a big drop in Russian support. And so that is one of the conditions. And the second condition is that Russia didn't want to see the escalation of the Afrin operation into a clash, direct clash between the Assad forces and the Turkish forces, because that kind of clash not only going to undermine the perception of progress towards political settlement in Syria, but it also can unravel the entire Astana process, which of course built around this understanding that at least for the foreseeable future, the Assad regime remains to be a legitimate partner in this transition process. And Turkey had accepted that approach in the Astana talks. And therefore, any clash between the Assad regime and Turkish forces is certainly going to present a huge challenge to Moscow, and Moscow is trying to prevent that from happening. Of course, we know that there was a telephone call between the President Erdogan and President Putin just yesterday, in which they discussed the possible intervention in Afrin of the Assad forces. I think in that sense, on the Turkish side, maybe there is a overestimation to what extent Moscow can fully control the Assad regime. As I mentioned before, I don't think Moscow was very enthusiastic.
The 17th edition of the IF Film Festival continues in Istanbul. The next stops will be Ankara and Izmir.
The 17th IF Istanbul Independent Film Festival kicked off on February 15th in Istanbul and is running until the 25th. The festival will move on to Ankara and Izmir afterwards, where screenings will be on between the 1st and 4th of March. The theme of the festival this year is To Life, and a total of 111 films from 36 different countries will be screened. 6 of the films in the festival have been nominated for the Oscars, in a total of 18 branches. Paul Thomas Anderson's latest movie, Phantom Thread, has been nominated in 6 branches, while the opening night movie of the festival, Lady Bird, has been nominated in 5 different branches. The movie, The Disaster Artist, will have its premiere on the closing night on February 25th. According to critics, the movie is perhaps the most important project in James Franco's career as a director. The Disaster Artist focuses on the making of the movie The Room, regarded as the greatest bad movie ever made. Franco is starring in the movie as Tommy Wiseau, as he is nominated for the Oscars in the Best Actor in a Leading Role category.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.